Joining us right now, Mario Mancuso. He joins us as a member of President Bush's response there. In fact, you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism at the time, so that had a lot to do with keeping America safe from the next hit. What did you think of what the President said last night? We are safer, he says, and yet the American people don't feel safer, according to the recent polls.
Yeah, well, good morning. I think he said a lot last night, and I feel differently about different parts of the speech. But let me start with the first point about being safer. You know, I hope he's right. I'm not sure he's right, and here's why. We can't assume that our improvements, and there have been many improvements since 9/11 in terms of our own ability to defend against terrorist attacks. We can't assume that those improvements overmatch how the terrorists have evolved in their own capabilities. And frankly, the terrorist threat today is more distributed. There's probably more talent at the middle management level, and they still have an intent to strike us. So, listen, for political reasons, it's clear why you make the assertion that we're safer. But as policymakers, it's important to realize that you just can't assume that we are, and you can't assume that the inputs that we have made equals the outputs that we all aspire to.
Well, I mean, you say that it may have been a political statement. I think, indeed, you're correct about that, given the fact that a new poll just came out that shows that about half of Americans believe we are not safer than we were prior to 2001. So he needed to say that politically, but I get the impression that he's taking this action and he's sort of kicking and screaming every step of the way. I mean, the military people have been saying this is what we need to do. A lot of his national security advisors are saying we need to go after ISIS, even if we have to go into Syria. But one gets the impression that his heart is not in it. Do you get that sense at all?
Yeah, I do. I think he's an intellectual supporter of the position that we need to do more. I don't think he's an emotional supporter of that position. And it's noteworthy, as you're right. New polls come out and say two things. First, that he's at his lowest level in terms of approval ratings in many years. And secondly, more Americans today believe that America should be engaged in the world than even a year ago. So it's noteworthy that this change of opinion happens at this time, that there seems to be a pretty significant sea change in the poll numbers. I think the strategy that he outlined last night, there are many, many open questions. I think he's, again, an intellectual supporter of the position, but execution matters. And frankly, he talked about having a broad coalition, which is a good idea, of our regional allies. But keep in mind, many of our regional allies are very wary of this administration. This administration has effectively exited the region. And hasn't taken action in Syria. And frankly, many of our allies believe that ISIL today, where it stands, its capabilities, its strength, its recruiting momentum, is directly related to what this administration hasn't done. So there's a lot of wariness there that we have to be mindful of as we assess next steps.
But as a former Bush official, a person who worked under President Bush, basically, isn't the president admitting that Bush had it right?
Listen, I think the prior administration, and I did serve in it, so maybe this is the fastest validation of the principle that you stand where you sit. But this set of circumstances was not just foreseeable. It was actually foreseen in large part in Iraq by President Bush in I think, 2007, 2008.
Yeah.
Gave a speech. So I do think it's validation, but at the end of the day, I think we have to look at this situation not through the eyes of a mortician, but through the eyes of a doctor. How do we make it better? It's in America's interest to make it better. I hope the president actually executes on the vision. Again, I think there are open questions, but there's a remarkable amount of similarity between the essential principles of this strategy against ISIL and what President Bush laid out in what was then called the global war on terror.
Well, and let's talk about that for a minute, because that to me is the striking discord here. The President Bush, that is, immediately saw the war that we were in, called it a war, called our enemy our enemy. This president last night had that opportunity. He didn't call it a war. He kept calling it counterterrorism measures. Is that a distinction without a difference?
I think that I saw the speech and I also read the text. And what was striking when you read the text is how legalistic it is, and how defensive the first part of the speech was. At the beginning of the speech, as many of the listeners who maybe had a chance to listen to the speech will note, the president started by saying that we've been doing these drone attacks all the time. Yeah, well, we have. But there's a lot of other things that we haven't been doing that we should have been doing, and frankly, we're a little bit behind. What's absolutely clear, though, in my view, is that irrespective of the words, right, the zeitgeist of this administration was very different than the zeitgeist of the Bush administration. I mean, I distinctly remember working in the Pentagon even, 7 years, 6, 7 years after 9/11, and you had this wartime sense of urgency.
Yeah. And
right?
Miriam, you just mentioned President George W. Bush's warnings about a premature withdrawal from Iraq, especially considering the warnings that he had specifically from his commanders in the field, the same commanders that warned Barack Obama against a premature pullout. Let's listen for a moment.
I know some in Washington would like us to start leaving Iraq now. To begin withdrawing before our commanders tell us we are ready would be dangerous. For Iraq, for the region, and for the United States. It would mean surrendering the future of Iraq to al-Qaeda. It would mean that we'd be risking mass killings on a horrific scale. It would mean we allow the terrorists to establish a safe haven in Iraq to replace the one they lost in Afghanistan.
Miriam Mancuso, if his advice back then would have been followed, would last night's speech even have been necessary from Barack Obama?
It's hard to second guess, and again, I think had President Bush's advice been followed, and no one's perfect, by the way, but I think we would be in a better place today in the region than we are today. That excerpt, I think, was classic President Bush, which is what leadership is all about. He knew that at certain times in history, what leadership means is not the position that you hold, but your openness to taking action and taking responsibility, and a president's duty to generate conviction for a policy, even when it's unpopular, maybe especially when it's unpopular. And when you read that, when you listen to those words and you compare it against the words that were used in last night's speech, right, you see the difference between perhaps a president who gets it in his heart as well as his head, and a president who feels that intellectually, finally, the facts have converged, and there's frankly nothing else to say to counter the course of action that's before you.
Mary Mancuso, thank you so much for joining us today.
America is safer.